So we're now going to move into biocontrol and war on weeds, and something very passionate to our minister. And recently, as we went and looked at a QE2 covenant just a few days before the Kaikoura earthquake, we had the privilege to fly into Molesworth Station with the minister. And as we went through, we saw the work of the mites in the Broom, and after 5 years of control, more and more success. And I think the minister was incredibly impressed to see what we can do with biological control. So unfortunately, fog has prevented Simon Fowler coming here. So Garry Houliston is from Landcare. He's the Program Manager for Biodiversity and has a lot to do with biological control, and something that we are very, very keen to look at in the war of weeds. So ladies and gentlemen, Garry Houliston.
Thank you, Lou. Yes, so as Lou mentioned, I'm a very, very late substitution for this presentation today, so you'll just have to bear with me, I'm afraid. So really, weeds in New Zealand are kind of a pretty big issue, as most of you are probably aware. One of the things in New Zealand is we have around about 25,000 exotic species, so around about 10% of the world's flora has actually been imported into New Zealand. And around about 10% of these have actually become naturalised. So in other words, they're outside of gardens, they're forming self-sustaining populations. So this kind of, we've got a similar number to the number of native plant species that we have present. And basically around about 500 of those are considered weeds. So in other words, they've got to that point sort of really past naturalisation and to the point where they're actually becoming an issue. So I mean, why... Oops, Lynly's put... So why worry? Well, I mean, in some ways it's kind of an obvious thing, and that some of these weeds can actually be quite severe ecological engineers, if you like. So they can dramatically change the trajectories of pieces of vegetation. So here's an example of Tradescantia underneath some native forest. And obviously, as you can see here, the chances of anything other than Tradescantia existing under this forest are pretty slim. Really, when eradication isn't feasible, I mean, once plants have really established beyond about a hectare, your chances of having a successful eradication where these have actually been attempted around the world is around about 33%. Once you've got sort of between 1 and 100 hectare, 1 and 100 hectares, you're around about a 33% chance of success. Once you're between 100 and 1,000 hectares of an established weed, you're looking at about a 25% chance of success. So I mean, basically, we can't always eradicate. We can't always get to that point where we can control things. The other thing is that successful biocontrol can provide enormous benefits and actually be enormously cost-effective. So for St John's wort, the St John's wort beetle that controls St John's wort, the sort of economic benefits of that have been calculated as being somewhere between $140 and $1.5 billion, depending on what the spread of that species may have been. So in other words, the cost of that the economic benefit derived from that biocontrol operations actually paid for all of the, effectively would have covered the cost of all the biocontrol research that's ever been undertaken in New Zealand. And in some other parts of the world, there's sort of been real recognition and celebration of biocontrol agents. So this is actually a community hall in Australia that was built in the 1930s, celebrating the prickly pear caterpillar that was a successful biocontrol agent over there. And likewise, this is a monument to the St John's wort beetle in the US, where again it was a very successful control. So obviously, what is biocontrol? It's really just a technique where, and it's used worldwide, we're attempting to restore the balance between a weed and the environment by reuniting it with some of its natural enemies. And of course, when you're talking to people about biocontrol, one of the reactions you often get, if my slide will ever go forward is, isn't biocontrol risky? And I mean, we've got this horribly wrong in the past. I mean, there's examples like stoats and cane toads in Australia. I mean, what we're talking about, though, is really quite a different process now than what has happened in the past. These two processes are completely different. So really, biocontrol, in the modern sense, it actually has an excellent safety record. So in New Zealand, there's around about a 90-year history. There's been 59 different agents released, and none of these have had significant non-target effects. So in other words, they haven't actually attacked plants other than the weed species that they were born in to target. Worldwide, there's been about 512 agents released, and only 4 of these have actually had serious non-target effects. The thing about these is that all of these attacks were in the same genus, and actually they were all well predicted before the release was undertaken. And I mean, there were lower standards of biosafety in the past, and basically these things certainly wouldn't happen in a New Zealand context, and they certainly wouldn't happen today. And there's sort of constant improvement in host range testing. If we have time today, we'll talk about that a little bit. But really, it's about improving the success of control programs and reducing potential risks. So, does it work? So we've brought in these agents. How many of them have actually been successful? Well, at least from global figures, we know around about 1/3 of programs are so successful that no other control options are actually required post-biocontrol. Around about half are partially successful. In other words, it's often effective in some habitats, but not all. I mean, this isn't really surprising, considering that weeds often have a very sort of high ecological amplitude, and you'll find them in a lot of different environments. And around about 1/6 of these are failures, where they don't actually have impact. The most common way for that to happen is actually for agents to not establish. So actually getting in some of these agents and actually having them form self-supporting populations is a bit of a challenge. And basically, yeah, as I mentioned, there's continuous work on improving the rate of success. So just some sort of New Zealand examples. So one species that's been mentioned over the last few days is old man's bed, or Clematis vitelba. This has actually proven to be a very difficult species to work on. There has been 3 agents released to date, but none of them have really had impact. There is further work at the moment looking at more examples down the track. Conversely, there are other examples where there has been quite considerable success. So this is Ragwort. These are photos of Ragwort from the past. Even 30, 40 years ago, if you went and talked to farmers, you would have heard a lot about what impacts ragwort were having in the environment. So there has been a ragwort flea beetle introduced, which has been very successful. You can see here the photo on the top there, and the bottom is obviously the same site where the flea beetle's been released. And basically the ragwort's really no longer there, actually. A lot of farmers that our biocontrol group have been talking to over the last few years have trouble even identifying ragwort. They don't really know what it is anymore. Mist flower is an interesting one, and certainly an interesting one from the conservation sector. So there's been a smut fungus released to control mist flower. That's had a pretty good impact, as you can see between the previous example there on your left versus the post-control photo on the right. You can see the native vegetation there. Most sort of importantly in this situation is that there's 2 threatened hebe species, Hebe bishopiana and acutiflora. Apologies to those that prefer Veronica as a genus treatment these days. But probably the mist flower biocontrol has really had a huge impact in control of these species. Again, Broom is an example where there's been several biocontrol agents released. One of these in particular has been very successful. The Broom gall mite has huge success, and it's actually causing death of plants in some areas. Heather, which is a large issue, and certainly in central North Island and around Tongariro, and particularly in the national park. There's around about probably 50,000 hectares of heather invasion in the park. So far, the biocontrol agents have controlled around about 3,000 hectares of that. They're sort of moving across the park in a front, and it is proving to be quite an effective control. Lantana, again, a rust has established and is starting to defoliate plants quite heavily. Tradescantia is another species that obviously a lot of people have a high interest in. Here you can see the effects of the leaf beetle and what they're actually doing just in defoliating the plant. More impressively, this is the stem beetle, and you can actually see in the foreground of this photo that it's actually removed really removed the biomass of the plant and caused it to collapse. So I mean, it's sort of early days on some of these, but we're seeing very promising results. There's also a new agent in the works for Tradescantia, which is a leaf spot pathogen. Woolly nightshade, again, the lace bug's having a great impact here. You can see in the photos. But I mean, we do need to be a little bit realistic around this. Biocontrol isn't a quick or instant fix. It may take decades to achieve results as things establish. It's certainly not suitable for all species. Some weeds are very problematic. I'm a plant geneticist and I've worked a lot with the biocontrol groups. Some weed species are actually quite complex, so it's almost like dealing with multiple organisms. So some of those systems are very difficult to manage. The level of control can vary. Some agents are certainly more damaging than others. It may only result in stopping further spread in some cases. It generally won't completely eradicate things. It's more a suppression. And there really are a lot of challenges. So very quickly, these are the current projects the Biocontrol group are working on. Those in black are the ones that we've highlighted today, but there's also all the other species you can see there in green. Funding for this work is kind of from multiple channels. There is MB support for some of this really developmental science behind it. But there's also this great National Biocontrol Collective. So that's a collaboration between a lot of the regional councils and Department of Conservation who are putting money in. They have a strong input into what species will be prioritised. And basically there's a sort of targeting meeting every year or so where we go through and look at what are going to be our best targets. And community groups often secure funding through sustainable farming funds. Very quickly, there's a few steps in getting it underway. First of all is it feasible? Is it going to be practical? So is the weed species a good target? Are there potential control agents from the literature from around the world? And also, is the weed tractable? In New Zealand, we often survey the weed, so this is bridal creeper. So during the survey for bridal creeper, we already found that there was a self-introduced rust present that could actually be used as a biocontrol agent. So it was already present in New Zealand, it was just a matter of dispersing it. But that's not always the case, of course, and we do have to go and find agents in other countries. So this is Lynly Hayes, who was originally going to give this presentation before Simon, looking for biocontrol agents in Chile, and really looking for agents that are suitable. So, never mind, we have to look for suitable agents, obviously, things that have high specificity. For those of you sort of not so familiar with biocontrol, a great example is just the monarch butterflies and the fact that they'll only feed on swan plant. So that's this kind of level of specificity that we're often looking for with biocontrol. So at Landcare Research, we're fortunate and we have some great facilities for this. We have containment facilities both in Lincoln and Auckland. The Auckland facility is actually one of the few pathogen facilities in the country. And then, of course, we do need to gain permission to release, and that's via the EPA process, which is quite a rigorous, robust process. It's based on risks, costs and benefits. So far, no applications for biocontrol agents have been rejected. I think what this reflects is that the biocontrol team are reasonably cautious about what they put forward. So far, really, there haven't been any sort of really controversial agents put forward. And then, of course, the last step, of course, we have to get out and release these things. Here's some releases in action, particularly on Tradescantia. So if anyone is interested in more detail, there's some contact information for Lynly. There is a newsletter that goes around. And maybe one day we'll have our own monument to a biocontrol agent in New Zealand. Thanks.